The silent killer of motivation is not laziness, lack of discipline, or failure. It is chronic mental overload. Unlike obvious burnout, this form of exhaustion doesn't announce itself with collapse or breakdown. It operates quietly in the background, slowly draining your drive while making you believe the problem is you. You still want to improve, you still care about your goals, but something feels heavy. Starting feels harder than it should. Even things that once excited you now feel distant or demanding. This happens when your mind is constantly occupied, not necessarily with hard work, but with unresolved inputs, unfinished thoughts, background worries, constant information, and emotional noise. Motivation thrives on clarity and direction, but overload fragments both. When your brain is juggling too many stimuli, decisions, and expectations, it shifts into conservation mode. It stops offering motivation because motivation is energy, and energy feels scarce. The dangerous part is that this state feels normal. You assume motivation should be forced, that you need to push harder, optimize more, or find better hacks. But the real issue is not a lack of desire, it is a surplus of mental clutter. Your mind has no space to generate momentum. Instead of moving forward, you stall, not because you are incapable, but because your cognitive bandwidth is saturated. This saturation dulls initiative. You procrastinate not out of avoidance, but out of overwhelm. Every task feels heavier because it competes with dozens of others already occupying your mental space. Motivation doesn't disappear in a dramatic moment. It fades quietly as your brain becomes overstimulated and under-recovered. Until this is recognized, people keep blaming themselves, trying to summon motivation from a system that is already depleted. And as long as the overload remains unaddressed, motivation cannot return, no matter how badly you want it. Mental overload builds gradually through habits that seem harmless on their own. Constant connectivity, endless information, multitasking, and emotional vigilance all contribute to a mind that never fully rests. Even when you are not actively working, your brain remains engaged, checking, anticipating, reacting. This creates a state where your attention is always partially occupied. Motivation requires a sense of available energy, but overload creates the opposite perception. Your brain believes it is already busy, even if you haven't made meaningful progress on what matters. As a result, starting a new task feels like adding weight to an already full system. You hesitate, you delay, not because you don't care, but because your mind is protecting itself from further strain. Over time, this leads to a dangerous misinterpretation. You begin to associate goals with exhaustion rather than purpose. The idea of progress triggers resistance because your brain expects more pressure, more noise, and more demand. This is why motivation often disappears even when circumstances improve. The external load may decrease, but the internal clutter remains. Unprocessed thoughts, unresolved commitments, and constant background input continue to drain mental energy. Without space, motivation has nowhere to arise. It cannot emerge in a mind that is always occupied. Until overload is reduced, every attempt to get motivated feels forced and short-lived. One of the most damaging effects of mental overload is how it distorts your relationship with effort. When your mind is overloaded, effort feels disproportionately costly. Small tasks feel heavy, and even minor decisions require excessive energy. This leads to avoidance, which then creates guilt, further increasing mental load. A feedback loop forms where lack of action generates more internal pressure, making motivation even harder to access. Over time, you may start questioning your character, assuming you have become lazy or undisciplined. In reality, your system is overstimulated and underprocessed.
Another subtle effect is the loss of anticipation. Motivation often begins as a quiet pull towards something meaningful, but overload drowns out this signal. Your mind becomes reactive instead of intentional, responding to what demands attention rather than moving toward what matters. This keeps you stuck in maintenance mode, where you are busy but not progressing. The absence of motivation then feels mysterious and frustrating because you still care. The desire is there, but the energy to act is missing. This resistance is not fear of failure or success. It is exhaustion disguised as apathy. Until the overload is addressed, pushing harder only deepens this resistance. Motivation cannot survive in a system that never gets relief.
Especially dangerous is that it mimics other problems. It looks like procrastination, lack of ambition, or even depression, but its root is different. Mental overload is not about emotional emptiness, it is about cognitive saturation. When your mind is constantly processing inputs, it loses the capacity to generate forward momentum. This is why rest alone often doesn't fix the problem. You can sleep, take breaks, or go on vacation and still feel unmotivated because the mental clutter travels with you. True recovery requires reduction, not just rest. It requires closing loops, simplifying commitments, and intentionally limiting inputs. Until your mental environment becomes quieter, motivation remains suppressed. Another overlooked factor is identity strain. When you hold too many roles, expectations, and self-demands simultaneously, your sense of direction blurs. Motivation thrives on alignment, knowing what matters and why. Overload fractures this alignment, pulling you in multiple directions at once. Your brain responds by disengaging. This disengagement is protective, not defective. It is your system trying to avoid collapse. Understanding this reframes the problem. Instead of asking why you are unmotivated, the better question becomes what is consuming your mental space. When you begin subtracting instead of adding, clarity slowly returns, and with clarity, motivation begins to breathe again. Motivation returns not when you force it, but when you create the conditions that allow it to exist. When mental overload decreases, your mind regains a sense of capacity. Tasks stop feeling threatening because they no longer compete with constant background noise. You begin to feel a subtle pull toward action again, not urgency, not pressure, but willingness. This is the natural state of a mind with space. As you simplify your inputs, reduce unresolved commitments, and allow your attention to settle, energy reappears quietly. You stop needing to convince yourself to care. Care becomes available on its own. This is why the most effective solution to lost motivation is not more intensity, but more clarity. When you know what matters and your mind is not crowded, action follows naturally. Over time, this clarity compounds. You rebuild trust in your ability to start, sustain, and finish what you choose. Motivation stops being something you chase and becomes something you experience as a byproduct of a well-managed mental environment. The silent killer loses its power the moment you recognize it, because awareness shifts the problem from personal failure to systemic overload. And once you stop blaming yourself and start clearing space, motivation doesn't need to be hunted down. It comes back on its own, steady and sustainable, ready to move when you are. Once mental overload is reduced, you begin to notice that motivation feels different than you expected. It is not explosive or dramatic. It does not arrive as a surge of inspiration. Instead, it feels quiet, steady, and almost ordinary. You find yourself starting things without a long internal debate. You move into tasks without resistance.
This is because motivation in its healthy form is not an emotion, it is a state of readiness. When your mind has space, action feels permissible again. There is less internal friction, fewer competing thoughts pulling you away. You are no longer negotiating with yourself at every step. This is often mistaken for a lack of passion, but it is actually a sign of alignment. Your energy is no longer wasted on managing overwhelm, so it becomes available for progress. This is why people who simplify their mental environment often appear unusually consistent. They are not more driven, they are less burdened. Their motivation is stable because it is not constantly being drained by noise. Another important shift happens in how you relate to goals. Under overload, goals feel like pressure. They represent more responsibility, more expectations, more mental weight. When overload is removed, goals begin to feel like direction instead of demand. You can think about the future without feeling anxious or depleted. This restores a sense of agency. You choose goals because they matter, not because you feel obligated to prove something. Motivation strengthens when goals feel self-directed rather than imposed. This is also when long-term thinking returns. Instead of focusing only on what you can survive today, you begin to consider what you want to build over time. That perspective is impossible in a constantly overloaded mind. Mental space allows vision to form, and vision naturally pulls action toward it. This is how motivation becomes sustainable, by being connected to meaning rather than pressure.
Your self-image begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as inconsistent or unreliable. This is critical because identity and motivation reinforce each other. When you believe you are someone who struggles to start, every task feels heavier. When you experience yourself starting naturally again, trust rebuilds. This trust reduces hesitation, which further strengthens motivation. The cycle reverses. Action creates confidence. Confidence reduces resistance. Resistance no longer blocks motivation. What once felt like a personal flaw reveals itself as a temporary state caused by overload. This realization is freeing. You stop trying to fix yourself and start managing your environment and commitments instead. Motivation becomes less about self-discipline and more about self-organization. This is a far more humane and effective approach.